Dr. Tanit, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry I have no cows in my presentation, but I do have Dr. Sanchai. Just to explain what payment for ecosystem services is, it's an agreement between the provider of a service and the user or the buyer of that service. And I can give you a very simple analogy. If you want to drive across Bangkok very quickly in your car, you go up onto the expressway and you pay to drive your car quickly up on the elevated highway. You are the user of the highway service, and the provider of that service is the Bangkok Expressway Company. That is PES, Payment for Expressway Services. It's exactly the same when it's an ecosystem service. And PES, as it's known as, is well established in terrestrial forest management. And one of the best and very earliest examples is in Vietnam, where the hydroelectric companies pay a fee to the protectors of the forest up in the watershed catchment area, where water is supplied to the reservoirs that the hydroelectric companies need to drive the turbines that generate the electricity for Ho Chi Minh City. If the forest was not well protected, a lot of sediment would wash into the reservoirs, and the companies would have to pay a lot more money to keep dredging out the sediment. So they pay per cubic meter of clean water that they use. And I'll come back to that example later on when I talk about the financing of PES. But it's much more complicated with mangroves because they're a much more open forest ecosystem, and of course they're linked to both land and sea. So for that reason, there haven't been many good examples yet of PES operating for mangroves. But just to go back one step, you've seen this sort of graph many times already during this conference, and I just want to highlight the fact that in terms of mangroves, we have all four of the main types of service: provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural. And biodiversity cuts across all four of those ecosystem services. So when we talk about PES, we're also talking about payment to maintain and support biodiversity as part of the ecosystem service. And obviously mangroves in particular, as Dr. Maxwell has just explained, are very important for coastal protection, for building the soil, and storing carbon. And as we heard earlier today from Michael, at least up to 6 millimeters per year of sediment can be deposited to help mangroves keep pace with sea level rise. But as we've also heard, pollination is a very, very important regulating ecosystem service, and mangroves depend very much on animals to do that function. Insects, and in the case of Sonoratia, bats pollinate the Sonoratia species. I want to also mention the supporting services because they're often overlooked a little bit. We know more and more about the importance of mangrove crabs, the small crabs, Busa mer, and the fiddler crabs that live in the mangrove, and they provide a vital service in nutrient cycling. They're burrows, and they're feeding on mangrove leaves that turn the leaf material into particles of very nutritious detritus that then provide food to the aquatic communities that are associated with mangroves. All of this is an essential service that contributes to the nutrient cycling. And so the diversity of crabs in this particular case, and we could add mollusks and a whole range of tiny worm-like animals called myofauna, they are all part of this very important ecosystem supporting service that the mangroves provides. And of course, we depend primarily on the provisioning services of the mangroves, not just wood and timber from the mangrove, but particularly the fishery resources, the fish, the crabs, and the shrimp, the mollusks that support the nutrition and livelihood of many, many people, particularly in this part of the world. And when we talk about PES, it's really just a tool within the toolbox of ecosystem-based approaches, where we're trying to balance our need to use provisioning services against the need to also protect and preserve the other services, the regulating and supporting services. And if we do that, we also then benefit from the cultural services through ecotourism, through education, through recreational activities that we wouldn't be able to enjoy otherwise if we didn't help protect the regulating and supporting and provisioning services. So they're all related. The example I want to give you of successful PES comes from southern Vietnam. The very southernmost province there in red is Cà Mau, and there are several other southern provinces, all of which had in the past huge mangrove areas. They were mainly part of the Mekong Delta, and mangrove dominated the entire coastal area of these southern provinces. But shrimp farming in particular was the cause of massive clearance of mangroves, and as shrimp farming intensified, there was less mangrove, but the arrival of shrimp diseases started to create very great hardship socially and economically. So there was pressure to try to return back to some sort of sustainability in terms of using the mangrove to provide aquatic production, but at the same time protect the other important services that the mangrove provide. So this is a typical traditional integrated system in southern Vietnam. According to the government law, which was passed a good many years ago, the farmers are supposed to keep 60% of the land area under mangrove and only use 40% for aquaculture. But as I explained, because of their wish to intensify, they cut more and more of the mangrove and created larger and larger space for intensive shrimp farming, but with very negative environmental consequences. It's a very simple system with a sluice gate, and it's a tidal holding and trapping system. Water comes in at high tide, they then close the sluice gate, and the aquatic species that have come in with the high tide are then trapped in the pond, and they are only allowed to be released when they are considered large enough to harvest, and at that point the farmer will put a bag net in the mouth of the sluice gate to allow the shrimp and crab and fish in the pond to, they think they're escaping, but they go straight into the bag net, of course. And this is the typical biodiversity that you get in any integrated mangrove pond. A lot of small fish, many, many shrimp, and there'll be a few crabs as well. So the process that the project undertook, and this was a project jointly managed by IUCN and SNV. SNV is a Dutch development agency, was to try to help the farmers to recover a more sustainable production system based on improving their production techniques to make them more hygienic so that they could qualify to sell their shrimp as organic shrimp. That means no pesticides or fertilizers or any chemical additives to the pond. They have to be very hygienic about waste not going into the pond, no animals, for instance, around the shrimp ponds. And they were also supported to plant mangroves to recover the pond system back to at least 50%. That was the minimum mangrove area that would trigger their farmer qualifying to become an organic shrimp producer. So there was a lot of education, capacity building, and also a lot of negotiation with the seafood processing companies to encourage them to support the development of organic shrimp. And their interest, of course, was to be able to sell organic shrimp as a high premium product into mainly European markets. And so they would pay the farmers a higher price for organic shrimp, and that was therefore the benefit coming back to the farmer over and above the price he would get for just normal shrimp production. And in addition to a higher price for organic shrimp, the farmers were also paid for planting the mangrove, and they received an annual payment based on each hectare of mangrove that they were helping to maintain. So all in all, this was the financial incentive that was generated by this PES model. And from the project results, which were very positive, it allowed the development of a policy which then led later on, as I'll explain, to a law in Vietnam that actually mandates PES as an official requirement for some of the users of ecosystem services. So just to summarize, I'll let you read that. Over 6,000 farmers were trained, and about 2/3, 4,000 of them actually qualified as certified organic shrimp producers. They formed very effective groups to help each other and share information. They received a higher price for their shrimp, as I said, and particularly because the pond was restored back to a very productive integrated mangrove pond system, they also benefited from the biodiversity richness, which was there in terms of all the other species of fish and wild shrimp that were incidental catches, but were very important because almost on a daily basis, they could take fish from the pond to feed their family, and they could sell mud crabs and the smaller white shrimp on a regular basis. They didn't have to wait to be paid by the processing plant for the tiger shrimp. That took them 4 months to produce, but they could get almost daily income from the incidental species in the pond. And there's an example of what I mean. On the left are the organic shrimp. These are black tiger shrimp, Kung Koladam. And on the right, the farmer is catching, again on a daily basis almost, mud crab that have either come into the pond or he's bought juvenile crabs from fishermen, stocked them in the pond, and he checks the catch net each day, and when he finds crabs that are big enough to market, he can sell those and return the smaller crabs back to the pond. So he's got bread and butter income from the fish and mud crab and the white shrimp, and he's got very good financial income when he does sell the organic shrimp. The certification is done by an independent company. First of all, it was Naturland, which is a Germany-based company, but now there are many other independent certification companies for seafood. The Aquaculture Stewardship Council, ASC, is a very popular one. So now the processing plants in South Vietnam, they're quite free to decide which certification system they want to follow. Some are easier than others to comply with. But the important thing underlining the whole effort of the project and the whole PES principle is that to qualify to be organic, the shrimp have to come from a pond that has at least 50% mangrove cover. So just to summarize, there are the main benefits: effective conservation of the mangrove ecosystem, higher value organic shrimp, and higher biodiversity value. And the leading species that benefits from a mangrove system like this is the mud crab. It's the most associated animal associated with mangroves right across Asia, but also high-value fish like the snapper here, and white shrimp, kung kao. And I emphasize the mud crab. It was mentioned, I think, this morning also by one of the previous speakers. Wherever you have healthy mangroves, you will have mud crab. And the reason is very simple. The mud crab life cycle is totally dependent on the mangrove. The females go offshore with their eggs. They release the larvae, but the larvae swim back, undergo changes, metamorphosis, and arrive back into the mangrove as first stage, very small crabs, about 2 to 4 millimeters. But they spend the next 3 to 6 months in the mangrove growing, living in the mangrove, before they move out again as sub-adults to start the life cycle all over again. And this is a fundamental, scientifically demonstrated life cycle. That was one of my PhD students who worked in Renong, Sean Moser, and he demonstrated very well just how effectively the mangroves support the life cycle of the mud crab. The project also looked at farms in Thailand. This is in Chantaburi, very similar with mangrove and an integrated system. The farmers were less interested in selling organic shrimp internationally, but they were very interested to try to improve the way they produced shrimp. So we helped them with simple improvements like choosing better quality post-larvae, rearing the post-larvae for a few days in a holding net before they were released to try to make them stronger and more resistant to predation. And you can see again, the mud crab comes up very much as a dominant product from the integrated mangrove crab pond in Chantaburi, with other species also contributing very significantly to the total annual income of the farmer. The other species of shrimp being white shrimp. The black tiger shrimp was never as successful in Chantaburi as in Vietnam. I think probably there were too many predatory fish, but his income from mud crab was very good. Similarly in Trat, here the farmers had the benefit of a much wider protection area of mangrove outside the shrimp ponds, but again, the income that was generated by mud crab was way ahead of the other species. But notice that grouper was second highest in income. Again, a very high value species, closely associated with mangrove, that was clearly benefiting from the outer zone of mangrove in Pred Nai. So I said the farmers in Thailand were less interested in selling internationally. That was because there is a very strong domestic market for seafood, particularly for shrimp, in Thailand, and they were very happy to receive the certification standard of the Department of Fisheries, and that follows the standard that's set by your agricultural department, which specifies good aquaculture practices, very common sense measures to ensure that the shrimp are healthy, that there is no impact negatively on the environment, and therefore the shrimp that are being sold are high in quality and therefore safe for consumers. So this was the way that the Thai farmers went in terms of their priorities. Back now to Vietnam, and basically, because of the success of PES for clean water, for the hydropower companies, and for organic shrimp, the government of Vietnam recently produced a new forest law, and they made a decree which actually specifies the charges that should be levied on the users of ecosystem services. In the first case, the hydroelectric producers now pay 36 dong, about 5 satang per kilowatt hour that they generate using the clean water that comes from the protected forest areas. And the other users of clean water, like industry, pay about 7 satang per cubic meter. Remember, without this forest protection, the water would not be as clean, and there would be a lot of sedimentation in the reservoirs above Ho Chi Minh City where the water is stored. In terms of aquaculture, the payment is based on at least 1% of the revenue that is realized by the companies that are benefiting from the protection of mangrove. And those that are still producing organic shrimp using the integrated mangrove aquaculture system are now paid quite well. It's $20 per hectare now for each hectare of mangrove that they're helping to conserve. So there's a very good legal payment system now in the aquaculture industry. And for those that take tourists into protected forest areas, there's a similar charge of 1% of the total revenue that the tourist companies generate. And just to give you an example of what I mean by the PES for aquaculture, here are mangroves protecting clam beds. The little stilt houses in the horizon there are the clam production beds, but behind the mangrove are small nursery ponds where they rear the clam spat before they put them out into the more distant production sites. And the point about the mangroves here is it's not only providing protection for the nursery ponds, but it seems that the spat of the clams need sediment with a mud content and a high organic matter content, which the mangroves provide. So the spat settlement areas are very much dependent on the presence of mangroves. An ecotourism example, the best one I have is in Cambodia, in Koh Kong. And this is a community-managed area. They have taken responsibility for managing several hundred hectares of mangrove, and they have created a very effective tourist site. The local people are members of a conservation group with elected officials, and they have an official agreement with the governor of Koh Kong province and the Department of Environment to manage the area for ecotourism. And tourists only pay about $1 per person to enter, but that generates about $50,000 per year. And as you can see on the right, that income covers all the running costs of maintaining the ecosystem facility. So it's a very self-sustaining, very successful example of payment for ecosystem services. In this case, tourists paying to enjoy the beauty of the mangroves and go along the walkway, the bridge, and the tower. And in particular for tourism, it's the flagship species that really attract tourists. And in Thailand, we have the otter, we have the mud lobster, and we have Dr. Sunshine with his big mud crab. In Bangladesh and India, the tiger attracts people. They don't care if they don't see one. It's just the thought they might see one that attracts them to go there. And this is a very strong selling point for mangrove tourism, mangrove ecotourism. I want to finish on mangrove forest carbon. You've heard quite a lot already about this. I've worked for many years with Sanit and Sonchai in Ranong, and I planted trees there, seedlings actually, 29 years ago. So I can tell you quite accurately today that after 29 years, the forest carbon is about 400 tons per hectare. But the soil carbon, which you add together with the tree carbon to get an ecosystem carbon, is about double that. So we're getting up to 800 to 900 tons per hectare of ecosystem carbon after 29 years. And so obviously this has a huge value, as you've heard. But what I do want to finish by saying is that we have to be less focused on just carbon and think of all the other ecosystem services that the mangroves provide. We can have carbon, we can sell carbon credits, but we shouldn't overlook the more immediate benefits that mangroves provide in terms of aquatic production, the ecotourism potential of mangroves, and a whole range of other benefits that we've been discussing over the last 2 days. So I think in the case of Thailand, what we really need is very clear legal guidance, the way that Vietnam has done it, to clearly identify what the responsibilities of the providers of the service are and the users of the service. And already there are many companies. Dr. Sanchai told me yesterday about 10 companies are already investing in mangrove carbon in Thailand. About 5,000 hectares, he told me, has already been allocated. This is one of the examples that's on the internet. It's very available to read. The Dow Chemical Company has invested in a mangrove carbon project for the first time. And it will take 10 years for them to realize the investment. So that's why I emphasize the importance of the other services that are much more immediate and potentially of greater benefit to local communities. And just to finish off, there is the largest mangrove project in the world. It's in the Indus Delta in Pakistan, and it's almost 250,000 hectares. And you can see the financial arrangement. $41 million has already been paid in carbon credits, but I couldn't see a lot of evidence of the long-term benefits that the local communities are going to get from this particular project. I'm going back to Pakistan in January to try and find out more about this and try to help develop a fair equity sharing mechanism for the benefits that undoubtedly mangrove carbon can provide. So I'll just leave you with the take-home messages. These are very preliminary, and I hope to learn a lot more about mangrove carbon in Thailand from talking to Dr. Sanchai and other people in DMCR tomorrow, actually. So thank you all very much. Khap khun mak.
Thank you very much, Professor Macintosh. We have enough time for questions and comments from the floor. Please, Professor. Please, Professor Maxwell.
Don, I'd like to ask you a question which sprung to mind as you were talking about Vietnam's mangrove restoration and its positive effects. In the mid-90s, I was there, and there seemed to be mangrove restoration activity, planting mostly one species. My question is, do you think there'll be more shrimp and more biodiversity in shrimp and crab production if there was several species in the restoration plantation? Thank you.
That's a very good question, Gordon. There's not a great deal of evidence either way. There is some suggestion that the mud crab prefer Avicennia, but then Avicennia tends to be lower in the intertidal zone, so it may just be that it's easier for the crabs to access Avicennia at high tide, compared to the higher levels. But certainly, diversity of mangrove tree species can only help with the diversity of associated aquatic species. That's just logical common sense. What we don't have is the scientific evidence to back that assumption up.
More questions are welcome. Mima? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. This is really, really fantastic presentation that you have, linking to the community, the benefits as well. And I really like it. Now, I'm just curious, and this is a big project, you've been waiting for 30 years to see the benefit. Now, given the government doesn't live for 30 years mostly, how are you going to encourage this systemic change? Now, how are you going to get the first step? We have a lot of young people interested in doing something like that, and a lot actually doing the community work as well. How can we actually get a kickstart big enough that to make a difference, not just an assignment or a toy project, putting it this way, from the university or the school, something actually can see the benefits. The young people can take lead in this. What will be your blueprint, given your experience of so many years?
Do you mean of mangrove carbon particularly? Yeah. Well, again, I think when you look back at the four main types of ecosystem service that mangroves provide, you have to build a model for carbon that also allows for the benefits of the other services. Carbon is part of the regulating service, but we need to have mechanisms to ensure that the other services are also supported and bring tangible benefits, financial benefits to particularly the local communities. But also the food chain, because the selling of shrimp, the food chain is quite, it's not long, but it involves a lot of different actors, suppliers of ice and transport suppliers and so on. So I think if we look more holistically at mangrove carbon, which undoubtedly is very, very important and is really a godsend now in terms of helping to increase the focus on mangrove rehabilitation and protection. Because you have to protect the forest for many years. As the Dow example shows, you have to do it for at least 10 years. In Pakistan, they're talking about 60 years for the project on mangrove carbon in the Indus Delta. That's a huge length of time. And you can't wait for just the benefits of carbon over many, many years. You have to build in, it seems to me, accommodation of benefits from the other services, which would include fisheries, aquaculture, ecotourism, other biodiversity services. How we do that hasn't been worked out yet, but I think it's a very necessary next step in the mangrove carbon debate with government and with the private sector.
Yes. It's possible to have one more question. Yeah. We have to. Well, it's okay. Please. Lady first.
Hello, Dr. Don. In your experience working in the mangrove, you have noticed the impact from the Vivi, by the way. The plastic pollution, the impact. I have seen a lot in Thailand, there's a lot of plastic, and sometimes it's in the Gulf of Thailand particularly, there's a lot of broken bamboo from the coastal erosion. Some of the forests in Chonburi, 20% of the forest floor was covered by the broken bamboo that have been set up, and that impact biodiversity. And due to the PES, the payment for ecosystem service, in some area where they have a lot of industrial, would there be any example that, in some, like example, one ecosystem, one forest, are there many multi-company that can jointly invest to conserve the mangrove ecosystem and also to restore it from the plastic pollution? Are there any example of this around the world? Because in Thailand, we have been working with Dow to demonstrate that solution in Rayong.
I only know of examples of plastic everywhere in mangroves, everywhere I've ever been in the last few years. Even when I was a student working in Malaysia, in the mangroves in Kuala Selangor, there were plastic bags and old plastic cups and things floating up and down on the Selangor River. So it's not a new phenomenon, it's just become much, much worse as population growth and our consumption have increased in quantity. I was talking about this actually yesterday. You can do cleanups, but it's not solving the problem because the plastic can float in from very far away. So you need a much more holistic approach. What I would say for the mangroves is that the value of the carbon credits that are being developed would justify spending some of that income on large-scale control methods for plastics and other waste material. I would also say two other things. One, mangroves tolerate organic pollution very well. They quite like high levels of nutrient, like nitrogen and phosphorus, but they hate anything that clogs the breathing cells of the mangrove seedlings. So oil, petrol or diesel, any kind of chemical that will block the ability of the mangrove seedlings to breathe is very, very detrimental. But the plastic pollution issue is so wide in Southeast Asia. And you have countries like Thailand and like Vietnam that are major plastic product producers. So it's a question of changing behavior. And I know here in Thailand that there's a lot of work going on to change the packaging. And in Europe now, we're very advanced now in taking plastic out of as much food packaging as we can. And that is making a big difference on the level of plastic waste. But I can't really answer your question, but I hope we're going to be talking about it tomorrow with DMCR as one of the many questions I have to discuss tomorrow.
Okay. Last question, Dr. Vijan, please.
Okay, thank you very much for your informative information. I have learned from you, especially when we talk about PACE, payment for ecological service. I heard for quite a long time when I was with university, but right now we talk this word again and again, but how we come to action, especially for the policy and regulation point of view. You have experience work with Vietnam, even the Bangladesh, or even in Thailand. How, especially, you have any recommendation for Thailand if we want to apply PACE for our policy and also implement on the ground or something like that? I would like to hear from you, especially when you compare to Vietnam, our environment is quite close.
Yes, thank you. It's a very difficult question to answer. The way the Vietnamese did it was to demonstrate a successful project-level PES mechanism. And because there was so much value in clean water for the hydropower companies to use and high value in the organic shrimp sector, which is huge in Vietnam, that prompted the government to come in and actually create the legal framework. How you would do it in Thailand, I really couldn't advise you today, but clearly it is possible. One of the things you have to identify right from the beginning is who are going to be the buyers of the ecosystem service and who are going to be the sellers. In other words, who will be responsible for maintaining the service that others will be willing to buy. Now, mangrove carbon is exactly that, except the agreement is not directly between the buyers and the sellers. It's indirect because the voluntary carbon market is like the stock market. You simply offer your credits and someone buys them, but that somebody could be in a foreign country, very likely is. Whereas PES, to be a true mechanism of PES, the buyers and sellers should know each other. But I think all I can say today is Thailand should start the dialogue to see how you could take this forward. Because I think the private sector here are very open to any responsible mechanisms that they can invest in, that they would see give good returns in terms of conserving environmental services that they themselves benefit from. I don't think there's any resistance to it. And you know, many countries now have an environmental tax for tourists when they spend a night in a hotel. There's a bedroom tax. I think Singapore has some sort of tax that you pay $2 or something on top of the hotel charge that is like an environmental surcharge that is recycled to help maintain a clean environment for the tourists. I mean, that's a very good example of PES in operation. Thailand could certainly do that with the very huge tourist sector that you have. When I was with IUCN here in Bangkok, we had a voluntary system where tourists could volunteer to pay a small extra charge in the hotel to pay for the cost of planting mangroves. But that was voluntary. It wasn't mandated by any legal requirement. But many people volunteered to pay an extra $2 or something, 100 baht maybe, as a donation to contribute to mangrove rehabilitation. So I think the will is here in Thailand. It's just a question of getting the government lead agencies, the private sector, and some of the community leaders together to have a very open discussion about which sectors would be appropriate for a PES pilot project, and who would be the buyers and who would be the sellers of the services. But Vietnam has done it very quickly. The project was 5 years from 2014, and by 2017, 18, they already had the legal framework in place.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Macintosh.
So